Little remembered today is Manhattan's Knickerbocker Athletic Club, which once sat on the corner of Madison Avenue and 45th Street. It was once one of the most exclusive and most successful athletic clubs in the nation. But in 1898, into that aristocratic environment came a story of intrigue, of a love triangle, of patent medicines, and of a trial of the century for murder most foul. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On November 22, 1877, the New York Times reported that the Knickerbocker Athletic Club would be holding its inaugural meeting on December 3rd and 4th. Open to all amateurs would be a 75-yard run, a 1-mile walk, running broad jump, quarter-mile run, running high jump, 3-mile walk, putting the shot, 1-mile run, 120 yards hurdle race, and half-mile run. The prizes, the Times reported, will be a gold medal to the winner of each event and a silver to the second. The blog Daytonian in Manhattan by Tom Miller explained in 2015, a membership in one or more of the exclusive men's clubs was a social necessity for wealthy gentlemen in the decades preceding the outbreak of the Civil War. As the century progressed, other clubs that were not purely social were founded. University clubs, professional clubs, and sporting clubs, for instance. Among the latter was the Manhattan Athletic Club, an organization for sporty sons of millionaires who pursued a broad array of activities, from robust sports like swimming, boxing, and track and field events, to the less physically taxing billiards and pool. The club was organized in November 1877. Miller writes that for several years the club maintained an exclusive membership of just 33, with members paying a substantial rent of $9,000 a year, the equivalent of around $390,000 today. But, Miller writes, the club slowly expanded its membership, requiring the construction of a new building. The New York Times reported on August 3, 1888, that the club had purchased the property of the Gospel Tabernacle Church on the southeast corner of Madison Avenue and 45th Street for $160,000. The Times reported that a magnificent clubhouse would be built on the site that would be a substantial 5-story brick structure with stone trimmings. In keeping with the exclusive tone, the project, including the acquisition of the property and the demolition of the old building, would be the princely sum of $500,000. The club was spectacular, maybe ostentatious. The sports magazine Outing wrote in July 1891 that the palatial structures will ages hence mark the taste and skill of the artist and the artisan of New York in the last decade of the 19th century. In 1895, the club scored a coup, hiring Harry Cornish, formerly athletic director of the Chicago Athletic Association. A man of whom the Times wrote, is a member and promoter of athletics, Mr. Cornish is without peer. The Times bragged that so long as Cornish is to be the athletic manager, it is pretty certain that the club will be heard from in track and field sports in 1896. The club was at its height, at a time when the Times would later report its membership included champion performers in many branches of sport. Those included Fred Westing, who had held the world record in the 100-yard dash, and Al F. Copeland, who had won the U.S. Outdoor National Championship in the 200-yard hurdle race 3 years in a row. Team members wore as their symbol the cherry diamond, an emblem that, the Times wrote, has been known and respected not only in America, but in almost every country in Europe. The Manhattan Athletic Club, colloquially called the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, was expensive, exclusive, successful, and about to become embroiled in scandal. The Hartford Courant reported on December 29, 1898. On the morning of December 24th, there came to the desk of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club office, by mail, a package wrapped in manila paper and sealed with wax. On the flat surface was written in a feminine hand, disguised to cause the impression that writing was done by a man, the address, Mr. Harry Cornish, Knickerbocker Club, Madison Avenue and 45th Street, New York City. In the wrapper of manila paper was a pasteboard box marked Tiffany. In the box was the usual cotton packaging, and in the center, wrapped in white tissue paper, was a vial holder of polished silver. The paper described the vial holder as a pretty medicine stand with silver mountings bearing the stamp of Tiffany and Company. The stand had evidently cost considerable. The stand also included a bit of medicine. The Courant writes that in the receiving cylinder was a 10-cent bottle of bromo seltzer. The vial would have been familiar. John Odell wrote in the Redex Report, a publication highlighting digital historical collections, that Isaac E. Emerson, the man who patented the formula for bromo seltzer, was as well known in the late 19th century as Bill Gates is today. Bromo seltzer was billed as a cure for exhaustion, headache, insomnia, brain fatigue, loss of appetite, and other common complaints. sold in distinctive little blue bottles. Cornish was, the Current writes, amused at his presence. On the night of December 28th, Mr. Cornish attended the theater with his aunt, Mrs. Kate J. Adams, described as a wealthy widow living in the city, and her married daughter, Mrs. Florence Rogers. Cornish lived with Adams on the third floor of an apartment house at the corner of Columbus Avenue and 86th Street, along with Rogers, her husband, and her mother-in-law. The three had supper together afterwards, and Cornish accompanied the ladies home. Cornish, the paper reported, had taken along the present that he had received to Mrs. Adams' flat to show her and her daughter. When at breakfast Mrs. Adams and her daughter complained of a headache, Cornish thought of the bottle of bromo seltzer that had come with his gift. Mrs. Adams, the Current writes, took a dose of it in water. She was instantly seized with convulsions and died within half an hour. Cornish had swallowed some of the contents at the same time as Mrs. Adams had taken the fatal draught. He was taken violently ill, but the doctor saved him after hard work. The paper reported a first-hand account. Laughingly, Mrs. Adams took the mixture and gave off an odor of almonds, but this was not noticed. Cornish also took some of the mixture. Suddenly, all were attracted by the screams of Mrs. Adams calling for her daughter. Mrs. Rogers rushed into the bathroom and found her mother writhing in pain on the floor, gasping for breath. Cornish himself grew ill. Cornish sent the hall boy of the apartment house for a doctor, who, the Boston Globe wrote, arrived just in time to see Mrs. Adams die. But the Current writes that the doctor gave a powerful antidote to Cornish. Ominously, the Current writes, Dr. Hitchcock tasted the poison, which was evidently cyanide of potassium. The theory that the police are working on, the Current wrote, is that the murder was intended, but that the intended victim was Harry Cornish. The paper wrote that police are attempting to discover where the vial came from. The Globe reported on the 30th that the little silver gewgaw was manufactured in Newark, New Jersey, and police were tracking its sale. The paper suggested that an arrest was imminent. The Birmingham, Alabama Age Herald reported on March 15th that the police and the entire detective force were called in and immediately began to work on the case. Cornish was closely questioned as to who could have any personal grudge against him. Suspicion was centered upon Roland B. Molineux, a young chemist living in Brooklyn. The Press Association noted that Molineux was a chemist and is the superintendent of a paint or color factory in Newark, where the vial holder was sold. In the manufacture of these colors at the factory, cyanide of mercury is used. This finding then created a new suspicion. The Age Herald continues. About this time, attention was called to the suspicious death of H.C. Barnett, a member of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club who had died there the previous October. It was supposed that the death was caused from an overdose of Cutnow powders, which he was in the habit of taking. The suspicion led to the exhuming of the body of Barnett, removing the stomach and having it chemically tested. It found also that traces of cyanide of mercury were evidence in the organs. The Brooklyn Standard Union described Barnett as a prosperous businessman. Historian Harold Schechter described him in his 2007 book, The Devil's Gentleman, as a 32-year-old bon vivant named Henry Crossman Barnett. Brown-haired, blue-eyed, with a small, neatly trimmed mustache and a decided paunch. He had joined the club, as one commentator put it, with a pleasant hope of reducing his weight. The Globe writes that Henry C. Barnett, who lived at the club and was in business at 19 Broad Street, received a package of arsenic on November 1st, part of which he took, believing it was a harmless powder known as Cutnow powder. He died 12 days later. This poison, as in Mr. Cornish's case, was received by mail at the Knickerbocker Athletic Club. Aside from having the requisite skills as a chemist, Molineux, the son of a famous Civil War Union general of volunteers, faced suspicion because he had motive against both Cornish and Barnett. Molineux was an athlete. An 1890 edition of the Wilkes-Barre Sunday Leader described him as the king of the horizontal bar. But as a member of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, he had clashed with Cornish over how Cornish ran the club. After several encounters, Molineux had gone to the board seeking to have Cornish fired. When the board stood behind Cornish, he quit the club and joined another. While newspapers described Cornish as having had a falling out with Barnett, it is clear that both courted the same woman. The Press Association reported in April that Barnett had been quite devoted to a very attractive young woman named Blanche Cheeseborough. The New York World reported that it had been rumored about the clubhouse that Mr. Barnett had asked Miss Cheeseborough to become his wife and that a date for the wedding had been fixed. But when Barnett died, Cheeseborough became engaged to Molineux. The Press Association writes that only 19 days after Barnett's death, she married Roland Molineux. But it was testimony in the February coroner's inquest that made the case against Molineux. A clerk at a business that rented private mailboxes identified Molineux as having rented a box in Barnett's name. The Baltimore Sun wrote it was proved some time ago that bottles of medicine had been sent to that box. The Sun writes that handwriting experts were called, and one after another they declared that the hand that wrote the address on the poison package and forged the names of Harry Cornish and H.C. Barnett to letters sent to drug firms ordering medicines was the hand of Roland Molineux. The coroner's jury concluded, we find that Catherine J. Adams came to her death on December 28, 1898, by poison by cyanide, administered by Harry S. Cornish, to whom said poison had been sent in a bottle of bromo seltzer by Roland B. Molineux. Molineux was arrested. The trials that followed were sensations, one of the so-called trials of the century. The case was taken before a grand jury in February, but the jury failed to indict and Molineux was released. The New York World reported that Molineux was actually discharged in court, only to be rearrested the very second he reached the corridor of the courthouse. Taken before a second grand jury, Molineux was indicted for the murder of Mrs. Adams. The trial came in November, lasted more than 13 weeks. The World wrote that Cornish told his story. He was on the witness stand for 4 days. His cross-examination was probably one of the most bitter ever listened to. Convinced that the case had failed, Molineux's attorney did not put up a defense. The World writes, after consulting about 12 hours on February 10, 1900, the juries filed into court. Guilty of murder in the first degree, announced the foreman. 6 days later, he was sentenced to death in the electric chair. But this convoluted case would not end so easily. After 20 months on death row in Sing Sing, Molineux's conviction was overturned on appeal. The issue was that the trial had allowed evidence suggesting that Molineux had murdered Barnett, even though he had only been charged with the murder of Adams. Justice William Werner of the appellate court wrote that the state cannot prove against the defendant any crime not alleged in the indictment. The principle is that the state generally cannot use a previous crime to imply a defendant's guilt. That rule is still today called the Molineux Rule, and is considered a landmark case regarding the admissibility of evidence in the state of New York. In the second trial, guilt largely turned on testimony regarding handwriting. In November of 1902, after nearly 4 years in prison on death row, Roland Molineux was acquitted by the jury after just 13 minutes of deliberation. Of course, there's still disagreement over the conduct of the trials and over Molineux's guilt, and the burning question, if Molineux didn't do it, then who did, has never been adequately answered. And if you think that Molineux got away with it, well, it cost him dearly. Not only did he spend years in prison, but his father nearly bankrupted himself paying for his defense, and his wife, Blanche, over whom he had allegedly committed murder, divorced him almost immediately after his acquittal and married her divorce attorney. He had become a playwright while in prison and had been married again, this time to his playwright broker, just before his play about prison called The Man Inside was to be performed. But he had become increasingly unpredictable over time, perhaps stressed by the death of his mother, but also perhaps under the weight of his time in prison and the constant suspicion of guilt, and some argue possibly suffering from syphilis. He had a violent break, and in 1913, just 10 days after his new wedding, was committed to an insane asylum. He died there in 1917. New York Times reporter William Grimes wrote in 2007 that poetic justice was served. Might have been a new century, but nemesis operated by the old Victorian rules. And in a strange irony, the original active ingredients in bromo seltzer, bromide, and acetanilide were both found to be poisonous, resulted in many deaths. So maybe the cyanide wasn't even necessary. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.